It's very kind of you, certainly for the IV to invite me. This has been a passion for mine for about 40 years or so. Quite recently, actually, I wrote a book on the topic. It's still a work in progress. The book's published, but what I'm going to be talking about primarily here is really the unscientific of evolution itself. The second part, which I will be doing a talk this year, but do it next year, is the scientific argument for creation. So let's start off quickly, because the topic is so large, I'm going to have trouble squeezing this in 45 minutes. But I want to ask a couple of questions. How many of you have a science background here? Okay, we've got a good number. So it just helps me to gauge how to actually pose the whole thing. The second question is, how many of you consider evolution as being a scientific fact? Nobody? At least one person. That's great. I'm glad. Great, so you'll probably be asking all the questions. And lastly, how many of you actually believe Adam and Eve, Noah, and all these people are real historic people? Okay, again, a good number. Okay. Well, that gives me some kind of feel for how we'll tackle the topic. So let's define what we're talking about. We're really talking about an Englishman, Darwin, came up with this theory. In fact, he didn't really come up with it because, in fact, it was a theory which goes really back to the Greeks. But it's a hypothesis, and they like to think of it as a theory. It's really just a hypothesis, and to be honest, it's actually a belief system. It's actually a religion. So this is what it says. Darwin, who lived in the 1800s, he was not sure how the first cells came about. But what he suggested is this: once those cells came into existence, they developed gradually, becoming more and more complex, having multiple cell organisms, until it provided all the creatures we now see on Earth. And that is the theory which is taught really in all our schools and universities. And it is that really which I want to challenge today. Now, I'm primarily going to speak from a scientific position, not really from a sort of theological or philosophical position. So what I'm hoping to do by the end of this talk, most of you have been educated in evolution to believe it as a fact. And it clouds how we see the world. I'm hoping today is to help you to take these lenses off and be much more critical about the science of evolution, if it's at all scientific. So at the end of this, I hope you'll have arguments when you're chatting or debating with your colleagues or friends and family. You can actually ask them some critical questions. So how has this come about? And how's that come about? And why is it that this is a theory which you believe, although there's no scientific basis for it? And to be able to do that, I need to take you through three views, if you like, of reality. The first really is matter. What actually matter is. Matter and energy are interchangeable. Information is one of the new sciences, and you live now in the information age. And then we're going to look at life. What we're going to look is really at how the laws pertaining to each of these entities, how they relate. And the reality is that the laws or behaviors which, for instance, matter, information, and life express, you cannot break those laws, and we'll show that. If you break those laws, what it means is your hypothesis, your theory is wrong. So let's start off with matter and energy. What we're really looking at is the fundamental physical laws. So things like gravity, for instance, or electromagnetism, or electricity, all of these things. We know how they work, we have a good understanding of them. And we're going to actually apply some of those. So we currently live in a finite universe. It's finely tuned, and it's actually perfect. If, for instance, any of the elements of the universe were just slightly out, we wouldn't exist. Stars wouldn't have formed. Certainly life wouldn't have occurred. So it's a system, a super complex system, but it's highly tuned. Now, the laws pertaining to matter are really fundamental laws. And when we talk about laws, we're really talking about behavior. If I were to drop this, it'll fall down. If I drop it 10 times, it'll fall down. So we can see a behavior there, right? And we can measure it, and we can do experiments on it, and we can learn a great deal about it. Those are the laws I'm talking about. So laws of magnetism, electricity, a whole range of things. And in fact, many of our scientists, like Ohms, like Faraday, Newton, all of them have written on this and have defined the laws pertaining to these particular elements of matter. So, just some of the characteristics of the laws. Really, it's the ability, it really helps us to discover the nature of these laws, their cause, their effect, and how we can apply them. It's the reason that human beings can build airplanes, build fans, build computers, because we understand the laws of nature, and we can then apply them and build, our technologies around them. You see, if these laws ever change, then our technology clearly wouldn't work. So some great things about it. These laws are implacable. They cannot change. They're independent of time and space. That's to say, for instance, the law of gravity. If I drop this here now, it falls. If I went back to London and dropped it, it falls. If I went to Australia, it falls. If I did this yesterday, it does the same thing, and we're prepared to say, look, if we do this tomorrow or a year's time, it will do the same thing. So these laws are independent, really, of time and space. If those laws ever changed, we could, let's say in the past, for instance, if a scientist said, well, in the past the laws were different, we could know nothing about the past, because all our understanding, we wouldn't know what the law was before. So you see, from the time the university started to exist, these laws have been to the present, and we can expect that they would go on into the future. Now, if we understand these laws, we can then verify theories, good theories. They become facts. For instance, if I say to you, at sea level, water will boil at 100 degrees centigrade. We can test that, we can observe that, and if we see that always the case, whether we're in Australia or whether we're here, then okay, that becomes a fact, that becomes a law. Okay? And the understanding of that, we can then refute a bad theory or bad hypothesis. So if we understand the law, we can apply them, and we can great technology, and we can do great things. We can build airplanes which can fly and such like. And if somebody comes up with a crazy idea, like evolution, for instance, we can test it against the laws of physics. Okay, so that gives you some idea. Now, I guess most of you might have played this game, Monopoly. Imagine imagine this to be our universe. So, the reality of this, of any such game, is that you need a mind to have created this. The physical components, the game, the rules, everything. In fact, the creator of this would have finely tuned this. They would have had made dice, which they all become random. The game concepts itself, the rules pertaining to that game would all have to come from a mind. So So this is our universe, and we can now play the game. We know what the rules are. We can go around the board. We can choose a character. We can throw the dice. We can buy houses and such like. Inside the game, if you used only the rules, if you use only what you know about the game according to the rules and the components, could you determine how that game came into existence? Just using the rules? No, you can't. Because the creator is outside of the game. And you can't also apply the rules here to the creator. You can't say, well, so many times you collect money, and therefore that's how the creator works, because the creator is outside of this. So you can't apply the rules to know how this came into existence, or this game came into existence, and you can't apply it to outside. Well, this is what materialist evolutionists try to do. They look at the rules which currently governs our universe. From using only those rules, they predict how the Earth comes into existence. Okay? But if the creator of the game or the system is outside, you could not know anything about that. Okay, so that's the basic principle I want to show you. And as we go through this, we will be looking at the laws of physics, the laws of information, the laws of life, and we'll see how many of those contradict the whole theory of evolution. Now, one of the more fundamental laws of physics is the second law of thermodynamics. And it's basically stated in this way. In an isolated system, the direction of spontaneous change is always from order to disorder. We see this, we observe it, we can experiment, we can test this out. You probably recognize this in your rooms. You know, you tidy it up one day, and somehow gradually it moves back to a disordered state, and you kind of think, who's doing this, right? And the more time there is, the more disorder we see. This is a fundamental rule. Evolutionists, materialists like to tell us, no, things can actually become more and more complex left to themselves. So, things naturally move from order to disorder, not as we are told, from simplicity to more complex. That's totally against this law, and this is one of the fundamental laws of physics. So if we can see, for instance, we have a bowl of fruits, we know over time they become more disordered until they return to their constituent parts. If we had a beautiful mansion, but did nothing, we didn't enter it or leave it, and nobody touched it for 100 or 200 years, inevitably it moves to more and more disorder. And that, I would like you to keep in your minds this fundamental principle. We'll be applying it as we go through. Now, we have a set of cards here. You can see that there is a level of recognizable order in it. If I were to say to you, I got this pack of cards, I had thrown them up, and when they landed, this is how they landed, you would probably not believe me. I mean, there's a possibility that could happen, but it's so small it's not even worth considering. However, if I said to you that that's how they landed, you would have no difficulty in believing what I said. The reality with this set here, set of cards there, is that you needed intelligence, a plan, of will to want to do this, and of course, energy to be able to do this. And you can order the cards like this. Intelligence is essential. Not so essential there. If you wanted to move the cards from this order to that order, the same element which created this, if you applied it, it could move from there to there. So, For the second law, here you have an external force, not only force, but intelligence, plan, energy, and the ability to do it, to move it in the opposite direction. We call disorder really entropy. The more disordered the thing is, the more entropy we say it has. It is the less entropy. Okay, so that tells you something. You need intelligence to be able to create order, but things inevitably move to disorder. Okay, and order is something which is clearly associated with the mind. Okay, so just closing on this topic, really, the Darwinian model simply says simple things can become more and more complex, although in fact it contradicts what we observe in experiments concerning the laws of entropy. Okay, so that's all I wanted to talk about really concerning the physical world. There's a great deal more but we don't have the time. What I want to now look at is the information. Now, all of you are significantly younger than me, and you probably know more about information than I do. So, we got a few questions on this. If you fail to answer it, you may have to come back next week to do the course again, right? So, what is information? This is my first question. What is information? To give you a clue. You can communicate it, you can process it, you can store it. So what's information? Anybody? Quick question, quick answer? Well, information primarily is documented, codified knowledge. So where does information come from? All our experience tells us information always comes from a mind. It always comes from intelligence. So when we say information is codified, it's documented knowledge. If I have an idea, let's say, and I want to tell you about, I want you to have the same idea as myself. I have to go through a process of picking a language, structuring words together which you also understand, and at some point either write it down, and hopefully you could read it, and then you would have the same image as I. Now, obviously things like stones couldn't do that because they don't have intelligence. So information is always associated with the mind. Saw a book on the ground, you would know that there was an author, somebody put that together. Information is also abstract. I can't get a bunch of information and throw it to you and say, catch this. It's not a physical thing, it's an abstract thing, and therefore material processes cannot create information. The only thing which can create, it can only originate from a mind, from an intelligent process. So the first law of information is that information always originates from an intelligent agent, always. We have no experience of that otherwise. Just some quick facts about information. As I've already said, information, the acquisition and the codification of information has to come from a mental process. It must come from an intelligent mind. Also, the rules of codifying is this. First of all, information has to have at least two symbols, letters, whatever it is. For instance, the computers will use binary ones and zeros. But natural languages, for instance, like English, for instance, use 26 characters, and different languages use maybe more characters. But inevitably, the minimum you must have is at least two characters. It requires language comprising of words, grammar, and rules. All of those are essential. And words serve as abstract representation of real-world entities. And I'll explain that, on the next slide, in fact. So I've got a couple of examples. So you could have cats represented as symbols, or it could be numbers, it could be just binary. So here I'll show you what I mean. So for instance, cat, it can be used in several languages. For instance, we've got it in English, we've got it in Cantonese, we have it in French, and we have it also in Farsi. Different symbols, but if, for instance, if the Persian speaker, cat is gourmet, that's actually the word for it, they understand. If they say gourmet, they'd have the picture of this cat. So these are abstract characters which represents a real world thing, and that is processed by our minds. Yeah, that's how we relate to it. So information is structured. It's, as I've already indicated, this is a non-material entity. It is not a property of matter. It's not a physical thing. It's not a property. So information can be stored on matter. For instance, I can store it on my book. And if the matter deteriorates because of entropy, because all things move to disorder, it's a physical thing, then obviously the information becomes impoverished. Yeah? It cannot originate from a purely material process. There's no material process left to itself can generate information. Basically, it generates knowledge. It's usually instructive, so information always is instructive. It cannot be predicted. For instance, I've started a sentence here, an equation, and I'd ask you to predict what the rest of the letters are. You can't predict it. Information cannot be predicted. And equally, the formula, you cannot predict it. So here's the full time. Time and tide waits for no man. And you've got the formula. So when you read it, time and tide waits for no man, that's instructive. It tells you a message. It tells you the tide won't hang around, basically, and wait for you. So it's instructive in this respect. This information theorists call specified complexity, because this cannot happen by chance. This message can't occur. The formula cannot occur just through a random process. And it always resolves uncertainty. So if I said to you, look, I've got to get a plane at 9 o'clock, I need to get to the airport, how do I get there? And you say, well, Greg, you just get on the car, you drive down the road, you turn left, and you drive for half an hour, and then you'll see the airport on the right. Now I have that information, I can do something with it. So it resolves uncertainty. And without intelligence, knowledge and information is irrelevant. If you don't have an intelligent agent, like 2 stones or whatever, it's irrelevant. It's really not necessary. Okay, so this is our first question. Let's see how many people actually get the right answer. Which one of these, if any, is information? Just put your hands up if you think you've got an answer. Which one of them? Anybody? Yes.
Are they all information source?
Sorry, a little louder.
They're all information of some
Sorts.
sort.
Anybody else? Yeah.
On their own, they're not information. Once it goes through a mind or something that can process.
Yeah. Absolutely. None of them are information. They're all predictable. They're all naturally produced. You know, the ice crystal, because of the structure, the atomic structure, you always get that when the temperature goes down. So particularly, below 0, you always get this structure. The wind on sand at a particular angle, at a particular force, will always produce this. All of these images, they are not information. Who thinks this is information now? Yeah. And could this have occurred by chance? Through some random process? We all know that this is a message given by an intelligent agent. If it's particularly to you, you're probably particularly happy. So we can see what information. So I hope now you all understand what information is, the clarity of that. And so, because human beings are intelligent and they can use the intelligence, they can create information and store it, the rest of it, we have a significant advantage over the rest of the animal world, because they remain in a sort of status, really. They are no more developed than they were 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, whereas we are. So that's all I want to really talk about information itself. Yes, quickly.
On the animal part, I've seen documentaries on animals that process new information, and then based on that, isn't that also?
Okay, certainly a dog, for instance, animals can learn, for instance, out of habit, out of instinct almost. So a dog, for instance, can do tremendous things, save people's lives, maybe, but we can talk about it later because I want to try and finish that, but if they could really process and do things, they would be up with us at your university and taking degrees or doing great paintings on the screen. So let's just look at life now and learning, understanding the physical world now and information. Let's see how that plays in with life itself. Now, if we go back to the 1600s, it used to be thought that spontaneous generation, that life occurs spontaneous generation. Because, for instance, there might have been rotting meat, and suddenly you see maggots appear on them, and people used to think, the rotten meat had elements which allowed the maggots to develop. But it was Francisco Redi and Louis Pasteur which demonstrated actually this was totally wrong. And they did this with an experiment. What Redi did was to put 3 jars, put some rotting meat in it. One he left open, the second he had a gauze on the top and a parchment on the other. And over time, flies came along, sensed the meat, laid eggs on the meat itself. The second one, they couldn't actually access the meat, and so just laid the eggs on the gauze. And of course, they couldn't sense the meat at all, so nothing happened there. And over time, you would see the maggots occur on the meat, on the gauze, but not on the parchment. And this is the scientific method which the Catholic Church actually developed and showed through a process that life always comes from life. That's the first rule of life. All our experience, our knowledge and understanding, life only comes from life. But what does the materialist, the evolutionist tell us? Spontaneous life can occur spontaneously, almost out of nothing. It totally breaks that law, and there's no explanation for it. There are lots of theories about how amino acids somehow joined together and made the early cells, but it's never been shown in experiment or observation. And to be honest, it is so complex, it's way beyond even the possibility of this occurring even over 14 billion years. Okay, so the second law of life is this, is living things procreate according to their kind. So we know ostriches produce, what, baby bears maybe? No, always ostriches, right? We know dogs produce dogs and swans produce swans. Always the case. And why is that? Well, let's look at what is the common thread we see through all life. Any ideas what it is? What's the common thread? Biological information. In fact, the third law of life is this, is that all organisms, living organisms, have biological information. Everything which is alive has biological information. So you'd be saying to yourself, so like, if information is an abstract thing, it's instructive and the rest of it, where does that come from? We have to ask ourselves that. We know it doesn't occur naturally, and we know that information always comes from the mind. So, in essence, really, there's not a common ancestor, as we've been told. You know, you have the first cells and that produced all life. What actually runs through all things? We know that we have a common author, because all life uses the same languages, the same alphabet, the same vocabulary. That's what's the common thread through there. Let's go a little further. We know if we see a building, we know that there was a builder. And if we see a painting, an artist, a book, we know there's an author. If there's a program, that's really proof that there was a programmer. We know that these things don't occur by themselves. Every organism has DNA, this biological information. It explains why life always comes from life, because the very first life passes its genetic information to its offspring. And because, let's say, for instance, a bee has the genetic information to produce a bee, to maintain a bee, it will pass that to its offspring. It doesn't pass on the information for a dog or any other creature. So that's why life only comes from life, because it's passed on, but also it's the reason really why it procreates according to its kind. You can only give what you have. I don't have the genetic code for wings or anything else, so consequently my children won't have the genetic code for wings. So what evolutionists or the Darwin model, if you remember correctly, said was that through mutation and natural selection is the process by which things develop and become more complex, and so you have all the life forms itself. But this, first of all, contradicts the law of entropy, the second law of thermodynamics, that things move from order to disorder, from complex things to simpler things. They don't move the other way around. This is, as I said, quite an emphatic law, and it breaks it. And the law of information, which equally says that information has to come from a mind. There's no way it can come from any other. So the whole idea, for instance, if you have a creature, let's say an organism, let's say a fly, if it gets a mutation, and we'll talk in the next slide about what a mutation actually is, the mutation tends to be detrimental. Okay, natural selection is also interesting. The whole idea of giraffes, that you have short-necked giraffes, they couldn't feed, and consequently they died off, and so consequently you had this constant process of a giraffe's neck getting longer and longer because the food supply was up. That's hogwash, to be honest, and I actually have a series of slides which show why this is completely wrong. We don't have time to do it, but let's just look at genetic mutations and entropy for the moment. Mutations are random word errors which arise when the cell duplicates. When you have the daughter cells, they will get the genetic information from the mother cell itself. They are occasionally neutral, that's to say sometimes they have very little impact, but overwhelmingly detrimental. In fact, if you think about it, if you have, if someone says, has a child, and the doctors come to them and say, look, your new child, your new son has a mutation. Do you instantly think, oh, he's going to be an X-Man, he's going to have these beaming eyes or wings, and he'll be able to do... You don't think that. That's not your initial... You say, so what does this mean? You initially, almost certainly think, this is going to be a disadvantage. Mutations are super detrimental, often lethal, certainly harmful. We don't really have mutations which are positive. And there are people who would say, well, we do things like sickle cell or for instance, bacteria, for instance, who are able to override antibiotics, and we can talk about that. But those aren't enhancements to the genetic code, and we can, maybe in the question and answer, I don't have any slides to talk to, but I do have a book which covers that in detail. So mutations genetic mutations are overwhelmingly detrimental. Fortunately, within the cell itself, it has these enzymes, which when a cell, let's say, divides, these enzymes which go reading the code, and when there are errors, it corrects those errors. And it's not 100%, but it does a pretty good job. And so consequently, if it's doing that, when you get a mutation, let's say a Darwinian mutation, which is supposed to give advantage, you have these enzymes will say, hey, this is wrong, I'm going to rechain, put the code back to what it should be. So in fact, the whole way life works is against evolution. If we get a chance, I'll show you some interesting videos which demonstrate this very, very well. So in this respect, these enzymes work very much against the evolutionary process. The whole living life is actually geared for stability, to keep all organisms healthy, and consequently they will abort any mutations within the cell. Now, humans have a mutation rate of about 60 mutations every time a cell divides. And it's the whole reason why we age, why my hair grays, why my skin, sorry about that, doesn't stretch. I'm not as great at playing cricket or badminton as the younger people, because as I age, the more and more errors occur within my genetic code, to the point in which at some point we all die. But it's worse than that, because every generation passes on a further 60 to 600 mutations to the next generation. And this is not only humans, it's actually all life. And so consequently, things do go extinct because they no longer fit, they're no longer able to produce effectively offspring. So you can see, even with living things, we're not moving up the chain, we're actually moving down the chain. We're less fit than our grandparents and our great-grandparents. And you may well say, actually, Greg, we do live longer than let's say, back 100 or 200 years ago. And that's true, because we have pretty good medication. Okay, I've only got 5 minutes, so I'm going to speed on here. Okay, so just talk quickly something about the cell. Within the cell you have the nucleus. The nucleus holds your DNA, and your DNA has this double helix which contains the information. Think of DNA really as a hard drive, okay? And the letters, you know, in computers you have ones and zeros held on magnetic or light or a number of ways, but within DNA we use chemicals for letters, and you just got 4 letters to express the information to build and maintain a particular organism. And it also uses 3-letter words, so that's the universe. So not only have you only got 4 letters, but each word which represents a real life thing is held within a 3-letter word. And through that, the information to support the living thing is created. So some quick takeaways there. It's just really a summary of what I've said there. So it's real information in a real way. In a manufacturing plant, for instance, we know that behind this, who created must be a mind, an engineer of some kind, and data is stored to run these machines, and a mind has built the information to run this. It's exactly the same within the cell. We have your DNA, let's say a particular protein needs to be built. The information is copied from your DNA into something called mRNA, which is like a little memory stick, and that's fed to a ribosome, which is a manufacturing plant. And the ribosome reads the code, and these are three-letter codes, and from that it builds a protein. So you can see this is digital information taken from your DNA. So you have to ask yourself, who wrote this code in the first place? Scientists have no explanation for this. Evolutionists have no explanation for how this comes about. And the paradox about this is this, that you have to have the raw material, right, the amino acids, basically it's like the bricks. You need to have machines in place. You have to have the information to be able to build an organism. All of that has to be in place on day one. You can't so have the information but no machines, because to read it and manufacture it. All of this has to be in place on day one, otherwise you don't have life. So some people, this last point really is the idea of theistic evolution. Some Christians, to help the evolutionists out, they say, well, okay, maybe you're right. You know, there's no natural process that can do this, but maybe God uses evolution to be able to build life. And so basically every now and again, let's explain this, is that he uses disease, death, and disorder to promote life. So every now and again he comes along and changes DNA within a living species, for instance, and they now have wings, and now they can now do all of these other things which, let's say, the previous generations didn't. It's called theistic evolution. Well, that fails very badly, because the point is we never see transitionary creatures. We don't see half tortoises, three-quarter tortoises. We don't see snails in the fossil records. We have virtually no transitionary creatures at all. We just have the very old and the very new. In fact, if you think about it like this, so the idea that God is constantly updating, first of all, what did it tell us about God? He can't do the job the first time around, so he has to keep updating, like we do. He has to keep updating every now and again, like Windows does. It sends you an update and an update. No, God does everything in perfection, right? If you go to a fossil graveyard for cars, you won't see too many of the very first cars. You won't see the sort of latest car which has come off the factory belts. What you see is lots of in-between, yeah? The cars which are 30 years old, 25 years old. You see a heck of a lot of those. In the fossil record, that's what we should always see. Overwhelmingly, it must be the in-between creatures, but we never see them. We just see the final things. So that's really, okay, this is really just a summary. Basically, the whole theory of evolution contradicts entropy, it contradicts the laws of information. All life has biological information. Where does that come from? Living things procreate according to their kind, yeah. So in essence, the whole evolutionary model just simply scientifically does not work. I was going to leave you for a short video. It's only about 2 minutes. It's interesting.
For thousands of years, humans have invented ways to propel themselves through water. But long before humans invented their propulsion systems, nature developed its own methods of moving through liquid space, not only in fish and other large aquatic creatures, but in organisms so tiny they cannot be seen by the naked eye. Perhaps the most amazing propulsion system on our entire planet is one that exists in bacteria. It's called the flagellum, a miniature propeller driven by a motor with many distinct mechanical parts, each made of proteins. The flagellum's motor resembles a human-designed rotary engine. It has a joint, bushings, a stator, and a rotor. It has a drive shaft and even its own clutch and braking system. In some bacteria, the flagellum motor has been clocked at 100,000 revolutions per minute. The motor is bidirectional and can shift from forward to reverse almost instantaneously. Some scientists suggest it operates at near 100% energy efficiency. All of this is done on a microscopic scale that is hard to imagine. The diameter of the flagellum motor is no more than 5 millionths of a centimeter. The bacterial flagellum flagellum is one of many molecular machines that scientists have discovered in the last several decades, including energy-producing turbines, information copying machines, and even robotic walking motors. The origin of these exquisite examples of nanotechnology is a mystery that has generated heated controversy among biologists over the past 2 decades.
Okay, that's it.